Hello, I'm Dahi O'Kieran and you're listening to Poetic Synergy, a programme that explores Eastern influences on the work of some Irish poets. This week I'm in the company of Terence Brown, Fellow Emeritus, former Professor of Anglo-Irish Literature at Trinity College Dublin, and Margaret Mills Harper, Glucksman Professor in Contemporary Writing in English at the University of Limerick and the newly appointed Director of the Yeats International Summer School. We will explore such influences on the work of William Butler Yeats. Terence and Meg, you are very welcome to the programme. Terence, I was wondering, for our listeners, could you tell us how Yeats became interested in the East and what particular influences he became most interested in?
Well, Yeats grew up under the influence of his very powerful, verbally gifted father, the painter John Butler Yeats, whose view of the world was positivist, scientific, sceptical about religious revelation. And the young Willie Yeats felt increasingly alienated from this way of looking at the world. He joined groups in Dublin who were beginning to study Oriental thinking. Young people met to reflect on the way in which Oriental Buddhist ways of thinking were antithetical to contemporary Irish, British ways of looking at the world. And as in the 1960s, Indian gurus would come over to the West and spread their Hindu view of things, there was an Oriental guru called Mohini Chatterjee, and he came to the West, and Yeats encountered him, and he felt that Chatterjee had taught him more about reality than any book had ever done. I suppose from Chatterjee he gained a kind of fundamental awareness that the Oriental ways of looking at the world, whether in Hindu thought or in Buddhist thought, were incarnational, that they meant there was reincarnation. And so I think this became one of the kind of core beliefs of Yeats through his whole life. Though you have to understand with a figure as complex and rich and interesting as Yeats that he possessed a mind that in a very strange way could be simultaneously credulous and sceptical, while he admitted to the doctrine of reincarnation. You sometimes feel in his poems and in his writings that he withholds ultimate belief in that system as in any system, which means that the kind of Oriental philosophy that Yeats upholds throughout much of his writing is often simply there as a kind of a poetic possibility. And you sense in some of Yeats's finest poems a kind of dialogue going on all the time between his own belief and his scepticism.
Wow, I think our listeners are chomping at the bit. You've opened so many possibilities about Yeats there, and we'll explore those in the poetry in a few minutes. For you, Meg, how do you think that Yeats became interested in the Oriental and Eastern philosophy and spiritualism?
One of the things that I'm involved in at the moment as a scholar is exploring Yeats in the 30s. The 20s and the 30s, there's an interesting kind of renewal of his interest in the East. There are several kind of emblems in the poetry that are signs of this, one of which is a sword that he was given, a 500-year-old Japanese sword, that he uses as a kind of symbol of something that stands out for him in the imagination as some important possibility for truth in a very profound sense. He was reading a lot of philosophy, and he was also reading Zen texts. He was also reading Patanjali's aphorisms of yoga, and he was really deeply engaged in ideas about what Asian philosophy in combination with the Western philosophical tradition could do for some of the questions that were plaguing him very immediately in those years when he was an old and increasingly ill man. And he really asks himself questions about life and death and uses the philosophies that he's reading to get more deeply engaged in those questions and the meanings of those questions in his poetry.
Terence, could you give us an example from one of the poems that you've chosen about how he struggles with that?
Well, a poem that he wrote about his earliest mentor, the Mohini Chatterjee figure, the guru that, in a sense, inspired his regard and for Eastern ways of thinking and for Eastern philosophy of the kind Meg has spoken about, is a poem that expresses his sense that what Mohini Chatterjee had taught him was reincarnation, a belief that most humans in most places at most times in one way or another have in fact believed, though it has very great complications for the philosopher, because it raises questions about what is the self. And those are the questions that become most troubling for Yeats as he grows older. Not only does the self survive death, because he'd been fascinated at through his midlife, and he attended many spiritualist seances trying to convince himself that the human self does actually survive after death. But the question of does the self have meaning in and of itself is problematic for Yeats in late life. And in the poem Mohini Chatterjee, he describes in the poem, I asked if I should pray, but the Brahmin said, pray for nothing. Say every night in bed, I've been a king, I've been a slave, nor is there anything, fool, rascal, knave, that I have not been, and yet upon my breast a myriad heads have lain. He's suggesting there that what the Brahmin is telling him, that your sense of having a unique individual self is deceptive. Rather, you have been many of these things. The self contains, in a sense, a multitudes, those selves that have existed in previous orders of the individual's being. And this becomes a deeply troubling thing, rather as well as a liberating notion that we will go on through the many cycles. The ultimate troubling thing about this is, of course, do we ever escape that cycle? Does it not come in the end to make all things meaningless? Because Yeats had also read Nietzsche and had come across the doctrine of eternal recurrence, and this concept of reincarnation would fit in with the eternal recurrence. Now, the whole notion of eternal recurrence is the source of all naysaying in ways of thinking about the world. I suppose one can bring the force of it home by thinking, if you're finding this broadcast just a little less than interesting, that it will be repeated forever and ever, and that you will spend the rest of eternity, all time that exists, all reality, listening to this broadcast over and over and over again, which would, I suspect, drain the will to live from the best of us. And that is where Yeats is struggling in this poem, that he might set at rest a boy's turbulent days. Mohini Chatterjee spoke these, or words like these. And the poem ends with the concept of the birth hour and the death hour meeting, or, as great sages say, men dance on deathless feet. Now, that sounds at one hand a very liberating and celebratory note, but the notion of dancing on deathless feet means that you will have to be dancing forever in this eternally recurrent cycle of birth, death, reincarnation, on, and it creates the sense of a kind of tragic view of things, rather than the usually consolatory notions that we associate with religion. A great deal of religious thought seems to be based on the notion of consoling us from the experiences that we have, to give us a reason for living and a comfort for the fears of death, as an American dramatist once famously put it. But Yeats seems to think that this Oriental view doesn't necessarily give us those things.
And in the poem Mohini Chatterjee, the definition for the name Mohini, I'm just going to read my notes here now. Mohini is a female avatar of the Hindu god Vishnu, portrayed as a femme fatale. And And an avatar is a manifestation of a deity in bodily form on earth. So in your introduction, you talked about how he used dramatic lyrics to examine incarnation and reincarnation. Is he trying to show us from this poem that he's doing it from an earthly place, and that he struggled as a mortal being trying to make sense of the immortal?
Well, that is often the conflict in his lyric poems and in his dramatic poems, that he is caught in an eternal binary, that there is eternity and there is time. Yeats's human imagination is sometimes almost tormented by that conflict. Some of his most famous late poems are about that sense of being caught between eternal images and revelatory moments, and what he called the foul rag and bone shop of the heart, as being confronted not with eternal truths, but with the day-to-day bits and pieces of things that he had constantly to shape into poems, but he wasn't ever certain that these poems actually reflected on the ontological level the reality of things.
Can I just say, one of the things that he was doing in these years was he was also setting out his philosophy in a theoretical way, in a book of philosophy that's very difficult to read and interesting and fascinating. But it's interesting to kind of watch Yeats writing poetry at the same time that he's trying systematically to set these ideas out. The poems embody ideas in a way. He puts the ideas into really, they are embodied. They're very physical. They're much more sensual and sexual than his early work. He is quite often posing in a poem an argument that he's having with himself. It's easy to sort of think about Yeats as a person who is always, whenever he thinks of an idea, whenever he decides that something is true and something is right, he's compelled to say, okay, now I think the opposite of that is also true in another realm, in another way of looking at things. And an awful lot of his late work does have, as Terence says, this kind of conflicted quality, but it's embodied not only in the personal body, but also in a poem, which is something that has a shape and has a form, kind of has a body in a way.
One of the key examples would be a late poem, Lapis Lazuli, in which, in that poem, he confronts the kind of demand that is often made of artists and lyric poems and lyric poets. What's the good of this stuff? The times are dangerous. If nothing quickly is done, we'll all be scuppered. Why are you a poet? Why are you wasting your times? Yeats said that he was getting tired with people who were always speaking of the palette and the fiddle bow at such a time, because nothing would be done. And Yeats's imaginative, emotional and philosophic answer to that question is to put in apposition the Occidental Western way of engaging with such awesome awareness of tragedy, and the Oriental, which is to create a sense of not exactly dispassionate unawareness of what's taking place, but a kind of spiritual disengagement from it that is strangely revivifying for the psyche, even in the midst of such horrors. And so he puts in kind of opposition to each other, the vision that's presented in a Western tragedy, Hamlet, Cordelia, figures who don't break up their lines to weep as they come to death. But he then imagines, as he looks at this piece of stone sculpture that has been shaped, and he sees the lines in it, the cracks that suggest to him the sages climbing to a spiritual journey up a mountain and stopping at a little halfway house there filled with the scent of blossom. And they look out on the horrors of civilization in disorder. And Yeats imagines their music that's played to them by a serving man, and they enter in a state of kind of psychic contemplation of things that, as I say, is set in opposition to the kind of tragic awareness that's presented in the great works such as King Lear and Hamlet in the West.
And this actually suggests something else that I think Yeats gets from the East. He quite often will pose abstract thinking on one side of the equation, and also the yearning for spiritual transcendence. And then in opposition to that, he puts an item, like a thing, like the sword. But in the poem Lapis Lazuli, he puts this piece of semi-precious stone, a lapis, this little sculpture made out of lapis lazuli. And it's as if the immediate presence of this piece of rock that is recreated in his mind, it's because, of course, it's not the piece of rock that you see on the page, it's this recreation of it in a poem. He puts that in an opposition to all of those immense abstractions. And I think he gets that specifically, I think, from Zen. He was really interested in where art comes from if there is also spiritual awareness. If you're going to have spiritual awareness, meaning that it's going to take you out of the immediate problems of your life into some other realm, then what happens to art, which is made out of people falling in love and people having their hearts broken, and I think in late Yeats, certainly when you see these immediate emblems on the page, they are also connected to his real interest in the East.
And I was wondering, for our listeners, just to make it come alive, would you mind reading the last verse from Lapis Lazuli?
I'd love to.
Yeah, thank you.
2 Chinamen, behind them a third, are carved in lapis lazuli. Over them flies a long-legged bird, a symbol of longevity. The third, doubtless a serving man, carries a musical instrument. Every discoloration of the stone, every accidental crack or dent seems a watercourse or an avalanche or lofty slope where it still snows, though doubtless plum or cherry branch sweetens the little halfway house those Chinamen climb towards. And I delight to imagine them seated there. There, on the mountain and the sky, on all the tragic scene they stare. One asks for mournful melodies. Accomplished fingers begin to play. Their eyes, mid many wrinkles, their eyes, their ancient glittering eyes, are gay.
Thank you. And we spoke there about how he used the image of climbing a mountain, and we'll stick with the mountain for the moment. So in the poem Meru, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, he looks at ancient civilizations again, and he looks at hermits upon Mount Meru or Everest, and he also has the echoes of ravens within that poem. I just wonder, could we explore the torment, and then where does the art come from that we've mentioned so far in the programme in the context of this poem?
Well, that poem is very powerful because it seems to take us to a point in Yeats's imagination where he engages with the idea in Oriental thinking that there is this point in which the endless reincarnations are somehow received into a transcendent reality that lies beyond the endless cycles of life and death. That would be a release to the Oriental mind. Our Occidental Judeo-Christian view of life after death resulting in some kind of ultimate endorsement of existence in the celestial reality is not amenable to this Oriental view that ultimately, since life is pain, that the ultimately thing to be hoped for is escape from the endless cycles of life, death, reincarnation into a state beyond that. That is something that Yeats explores very deeply in the volume Meg has already referred to, his A Vision which he tried to express his philosophy of the world and of life and death. And the great problem in that book is that its terrible sense of endless cycles going on forever in the kind of Nietzschean way I described earlier. And yet there is a sense there in the end of the book that he envisages some ultimate escape from that, because the endless repetition of things is a kind of terrible and terrifying vision. And in Meru, I think he seems to engage with the possibility that that escape can be possible. But it's an escape that, if you think of it as escape, raises very severe questions about how the West thinks of its own reality, because there is a kind of nihilism involved in saying that the only hope for us is escape from the endless cycles. And I think that poem, with its cold mountain regions, with its vision of sages looking out over the terror of reality, expresses the Western sense that it fears its own nihilism.
It's probably worth mentioning about this poem that it's talking about our attraction to this, the problematic attraction that we have to this idea, is that it's a sonnet, which is, of course, a Western form of love poetry. And so when you put anything into a sonnet, you bring all of the history of the sonnet form into the poem. And the sonnet is not only a love poem, but, of course, it's a poem that often falls into two parts and is a kind of an argument. There's a proposition in the first part of the sonnet, and then there's a countering vision in the second part. And the other thing about Meru, I just was thinking that Terence mentioned earlier Yeats's figure of this ancient Celtic Irish hermit whose Christianity is very un-Western, un-Roman. That hermit appears in this sequence called Supernatural Songs. This is a late sequence of Yeats's. And the poem Meru is the last poem in that sequence. And so it resonates with all of those other ideas too.
And in the poem Vacillation, for me, reading it, he starts off with a rejection of Christianity through Greek philosophy and ends up arguing with a Christian philosopher called Van Hugel at the end. But we have Yeats working out his own philosophy in that.
Yeats basically is not an Orthodox Christian, but there's no question that his mind is formed by Christianity. Key images from Christianity recur in his poetry, and a particular image that is the imagery of the concept of the divine becoming bodily, becoming human, the Christian notion of incarnation. He's fascinated by that, though he's also fascinated in a poem such as Leda and the Swan, where he thinks of Zeus impregnating a human girl who produces historical events from that conjunction. So he's interested in the concept of the divine becoming incarnate. And at the heart of the notion of the incarnate deity is that this world is holy. And Yeats took from Blake, whom he'd studied deeply as a young man, the notion that the very stuff of reality, of the universe, is a holy thing, that it's, in a sense, sacred. And Blake was a poet deeply opposed to scientific, positivist ways of looking at the world, which he called Newton's sleep. And he wanted the culture to wake up from Newton's sleep. And I think Yeats, throughout his life, although in many moments you think that he's a highly unorthodox Christian, if Christian at all. And in that poem, Vacillation, he says, in the end, for all that I am persuaded by the thinking of von Hugel, that Christianity has wonderful images and symbolic ways of understanding things, I'm not a Christian. He links himself with Homer's unchristened heart. He is also aware that in the great images, particularly the image of the incarnate deity, that makes everything holy, reality itself holy, not something that science can take to pieces and reconstruct in some kind of ultimately secular way. He remains a Christian thinker.
I think there's something else to say, too, about that, which is that the Christianity is certainly there, but in opposition to Van Hogel, what he's got is Homer. And so what he's got is art. What he has is poetry. And quite often, Yeats, and he gets this from Blake as well, he connects the deity with the human imagination. It is in Yeats quite often, and he connects this, again, in the late years with Eastern thinking. This very sacredness, this very spiritual core of the universe is something that people make up. That, like, as one of my favorite passages is from The Tower, where he talks about how it's human beings, it's what we do and how we think of the world that actually creates the world, and not only creates the world, but creates the afterlives as well. He says, I declare my faith. I mock Plotinus' thought, and cry in Plato's teeth, death and life were not, till man made up the whole, made lock, stock, and barrel out of his bitter soul. Aye, sun and moon and star, all, and further add to that being dead, we rise, dream, and create translunar paradise. So he's always interested in the way human beings engage with the other world and make it.
One of the most remarkable moments in late Yeats is when he writes this basic, simple sentence that man cannot know the truth, but he can embody it. And I think that notion of the incarnate truth, one that also becomes present in art as well, is an expression of that, I kind of think, underlying philosophic position that Yeats arrives at very late in life.
Terence and Meg, Tagore said about Yeats, like a cut diamond that needs the light of the sky to show itself, the human soul on its own cannot express its essence and remains dark. Only when it reflects the light from something greater than itself does it come into its own. Thank you so much for your insight and for showing us the light that is the diamond that W.B. Yeats is in today's programme.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This series has been kindly funded through the Sound and Vision scheme from the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland.